today we are reporting on the inflation report. It came in double the Fed's target. So we're at 4.1% inflation right now with a goal of 2%.
Yeah. And as you guys know, the reason why we're going live today is how important this is, because this is actually the real thing that investors watch, is this PCE report. And it came out a little bit higher, as you guys know. And the reason why this is important is because it's the chain of events typically, even though the 10-year went down a little bit today. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the 10-year, over this week. But generally, when inflation goes up, then the Fed is not going to be cutting rates anytime soon. And of course, as real estate investors, that's what we all want.
Yeah, and it's really moving in the wrong direction, because everyone wants these rate cuts, but in order to get these rate cuts, you really need inflation to start cooling. And it really wasn't just oil, because if you look at the core inflation, that still was at 3.4%, which is way above the Fed's target. So basically, this oil issue is now creeping into the rest of the economy, which Warsh specifically said that he was trying to prevent.
Yeah, so don't forget, the Fed's target is 2%, right? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about core inflation, what we're really talking about is it's really 4.1, but core inflation strips out energy and it strips out food. Isn't that convenient? It strips out energy. And of course, everybody knows what's going on with energy. Danielle and I just got up to Utah, and we saw it all the way as we were hitting the pumps all the way up. It's going to be really interesting to see how summer travel goes up this particular year. But anyway, so 3.4 is still quite high. And so what this really means is that if you're a real estate investor, if you're planning on refinancing or you're planning on rates going down, which I think is kind of generally what everybody's hanging on. And also maybe it's just time for you to stop focusing on the federal funds rate, which is what a lot of people do, and really focus on this PCE, because the PCE is the rate that really most real estate investors watch. Because it just has a chain of events.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is consumer spending actually rose. So with all this inflation, consumer spending rose 0.7%. So I think that's really interesting, because that means people are still spending through the inflation, which is not necessarily a good sign, because for the housing market or for, the apartment market, because it basically means people aren't saving any money. If they were saving money, they're now just continuing to spend how they spent before, which is dipping into their savings account.
Yeah. And the one thing, as you guys who are real estate investors, and maybe some of you that are not, you can work the other side of inflation. So inflation is simply rising prices, as probably most of you understand what that is. So if you're holding on to something that is a hard asset, whatever that hard asset is, it doesn't necessarily have to be real estate, then you can pretty much calculate what your rate of inflation is. So another way to look at it is if you're saving money. If you're saving money and you're making 1 or 2%, let's say, maybe you're in some kind of a money market where it's a little bit higher, the inflation rate should be lower than the saving money rate. So in other words, if it's not, then your money is actually losing purchasing power. So that's why watching these indicators are extremely important, because there's money moves that are being made. There's positions being made based on refinances, if possible, and also acquisitions. And there's all these things that happen as a result of the PCE, which turns into interest rates, which turns into the 10-year treasury, which turns into cap rates. For those of you cap rates are right now higher, way higher than they were just a couple of years ago, which is why values for specifically commercial is down.
So you're saying basically if somebody's not making 4.1% on their money, they're actually losing money based on today's inflation report.
Right. Well, right. That would make sense, right? Because now it's not direct, but it's a gauge, right? So if the indicator is 4.1, and it is, and you're making 1 or 2, then you're for sure falling backwards on the money that's in the bank as a saver. So the goal obviously is to have your money invested in whatever it is, some kind of, that's why there's all these marketing branded inflation adjusted, indexes and, all these kinds of things. You're just going to want to make sure wherever you're headed that you're going to want to be in those things. And by the way, you should be anyway. That's part of the reason why we're so bullish on real estate, because, if you're buying let's say a $500,000 house, you personally only need, let's say, $100,000 of your own money, and the rest is actually borrowed. And so that's a really important piece, because you're getting inflation adjusted on the entire 500, even though you're borrowing 400. So this is just purely leverage and using the system to because the inflation is obviously going to be on the 500, not including the money that actually wasn't even yours in the beginning. It was somebody else. And if it's covered by a tenant, then that's the golden ticket. The golden ticket is to get debt, have it paid off by somebody else, and then let inflation do its thing.
So let's talk about mortgage rates. So they really don't need a Fed hike to stay high. So all of you guys that are watching that you're like, okay, the Fed did not change rates when they met last week. The issue with that is now that these inflation rates came back high, borrowing costs certainly could go up because of the bond market. And in fact, my mortgage lender messaged me a few days ago saying, if this report comes back high, that, you should lock in rates by Thursday, because on Friday, you were going to see an increase in rates. So most likely we'll see an increase in rates tomorrow, just based on this report, because the bond market doesn't like the inflation, and the bond market actually sets mortgage rates more than the Federal Reserve does.
What's interesting and of course confusing is that the 10-year actually went down at the news already. And that's right. just in this last hour or two, right? So it's going to be interesting to watch to see what happens. But I think this is probably the better indicator than the Fed funds rate. There's a whole lot of focus on the federal funds rate. The other interesting thing that I read this morning, preparing for this, was that, as you guys know, when Warsh came out and talked recently, and the Fed was neutral on the federal funds rate, he kind of had a split, board, I guess. And so apparently some of that language has been revised, because there was some stuff in there about rate cuts, and apparently that was revised. I got to dig into that today a little bit more, because I wasn't able to see the before and after reports. I just saw that reported by somebody else. But that, I think, is very, very interesting and very, very telling, because, as you guys know, he didn't really take a position. Talking about Warsh, he just said that everything was going to be moved to his task forces, which, however, Trump did come out and talk about. His position is that he wants lower rates. So it's going to be really interesting to see how lower rates happen when we've got the PCE and of course the CPI kind of rising.
Yeah, well, double what they wanted. It's not just rising, it's double. So yeah, and Warsh is under a lot of pressure, because you have Trump on one side, like lower rates, and obviously a lot of investors want that too. But then on the other end of it, you have really high inflation. And so he's trying to balance, both of those things with what he said was a very stable job market.
I want to invite you to a live training that I'm running, and it's the one that I would actually want a seat in myself. And we're going to be covering 3 things that matter right now. A straight read on the State of the Union economy, how to use AI to drive real revenue to your business, and how to use this real estate crash so that you can participate in what I think is going to be generational wealth. And this is all live on July 2nd. Just sign up below.